It's spinning. John, I rolled a 2.
How much setting creation do you do in advance of playing? And how much do you do during the game itself? That is our question for today.
Welcome to Roll for Topic, a roundtable discussion about topics related to running role-playing games. My name is Andy Rao.
And I'm John Corey.
And once again, John is filling in for Chris, who is still absent, being a new father of a healthy and happy young baby. Chris will be returning at some point in the near future, but in the meantime, John has graciously stepped up to the plate and is co-hosting. So, John.
I love it. I might not let Chris come back, so.
Yeah. You guys can battle it out in the role-playing combat system of your choice.
There you go. That's a good idea.
Can I recommend Rollmaster? It has very detailed,
yes.
Very detailed critical hit tables.
And he'll quit because he won't want to make the character.
So. That's right. Yes. You know, John, you're one of the few people I know who has some Rollmaster history. Is that the case?
Yes, it is the case. I've played Rollmaster several times.
Those 3-hour character creation sessions. Oh.
Yes. 3 hours was a short one.
That's right. If you were really burning through it.
You had 10 stats in that game.
Not only 10 stats, but you had like your actual stats and then your potential stats.
Yes, and then derived stats. So you had to get your 10 stats, derive other stats, and then there was potential stats, and then if you were a wizard, forget it. You had to find your spell tables, and it was right. That was like 8 hours then, all of a sudden.
Yeah, so you just had to trust that the game designers knew what they were doing because, yes. It was scary.
Yes.
So, John, before we jump into our topic, I understand that you have dipped your toes into the scary world of running role-playing games over the internet. Is that true?
Yes,
and if so,
it's true.
Tell us how it went.
It went great. So I have played in online games before. I've played an online campaign before, and I've played in various ways. I've played over Zoom. I've played using just Roll20. Various combinations of things. Discord audio. So I think I was feeling a little overwhelmed about doing it myself. I ended up using Roll20 and Zoom. And it went great. And I think one of the big keys to success is there were two things that I think made it successful. One was somebody had asked me, I'm looking for something different. What do you think about Dungeon World? And I said, well, I love Dungeon World. I'll run a game for you. So I ran my Dungeon World Mad Libs game, which is a Dungeon World one-shot. And I have done that a dozen times at conventions or whatnot. So I was very comfortable with the game I was running. I was very familiar with it. So I was in my element there. And then I ended up with 4 great players who were into the idea of improvising with me because it was kind of like an improvisational style game. So sometimes you run into players who, like, you ask them a question like, what does your spell look like when you cast it? Or what does this castle look like? Or, you give them opportunities to create, and that's not what they're here to do. But all of the players in my game really wanted to do that. Had a great time. They were naming NPCs without any prompting, and it was great. So I think I'm ready to resume my campaign, and I think I will use Roll20 and Zoom.
Okay.
I think Zoom is really important to me because I need to see people to game with them, right? I'm a very visual person, and I think table management is something I'm good at, and I can't do it without seeing people. So I know people do it audio only. I don't think I could do that.
I have a couple questions. First of all, I have heard in numerous different contexts about your kind of famous Mad Libs Dungeon World game that you have run in many conventions and stuff. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you explain what exactly that is? What's a Mad Libs version of Dungeon World?
I got the idea from this website, RPG Alchemy, and I'll send you the link for the show notes. But what it is you have a sentence, right? And you're filling in the blanks on the sentence. And the sentence is constructed to be sort of a basic adventure plot, okay? So what I do is I have these 6 cards that I cut out, and each of them has an intro phrase and then a series of choices on them. So the first one says, we are ... And then the choices are exploring an ancient ruin on the site of an ancient battlefield, and there's like 6 choices. And then the next one is, and we are seeking. And then it says, a wondrous treasure, an unholy portal, something. And then the third one is, we are here to, close the unholy portal. And then the last 2 are, and it's guarded by blank and blank. So I hand these out to the players, and they all make a selection. So I don't let them write in just anything they want, but they select from these multiple choice things, and then we make the sentence. So it'll say, we are seeking a floating castle which lies on the edge of the Fey realms. We are here to close an unholy portal which is guarded by twisted abominations and a fallen angel. So that's what we came up with last night. So then I go and I say, okay, so tell me about this castle. Where is it? And one of my players said, well, it used to be an elvish castle, but there was a magical accident, and it exploded out of the middle of an elvish city, and it's been floating for 100 years across the world. That's great. So I had players who were willing to contribute that stuff. So I go around and ask more questions, like, why are you here? Who sent you here? What are you, and we sort of come up with the adventure that way, and then we play through it. It actually probably takes an hour to get to the point where we're actually playing the game, because we're creating characters and then creating the bonds, and then I'm asking these intro questions, and then we've cobbled together this adventure that we then play through in like an hour and a half or 2 hours.
I'm sometimes a little surprised that in no iteration of Dungeons and Dragons has there been any guidance towards sort of ad-libbing up a scenario or adventure like that.
Yeah.
Could you do this for D&D if someone said, I want you to run D&D? Would you do this style of adventure creation with them? Or are the rules of D&D such that it doesn't work?
I think there's a couple advantages that Dungeon World has in that it does not scale like D&D does. So you don't have to worry about challenge levels and that kind of thing, right? There's sort of three or four levels of creature, right? There's a minion, a regular, a boss, and a big boss, right? So you can just swap out and say, well, the big boss does 1d12 of damage and has about 25 hit points and can do something special. So you can add that to a game on the fly. I think you could do it with D&D. I think D&D is not perfectly set for that, because I think you need to do more preparation for your encounters and your statistics. I think that's the one thing that is a barrier to that kind of thing. I also think character creation takes a little longer in D&D, because in Dungeon World, it's just kind of fill in the blanks. And a lot of the things that people do for character creation in D&D, like come up with a backstory or sort of an image for their character, that's all just fill in the blanks on Dungeon World, right? It even has a spot for what's your look. It even suggests names, right? For what's your character's name that you can just fill in. So I think that makes it easy to get going. And then the last part of character creation in Dungeon World is this, where you create bonds with the other characters. This is why it works well with strangers, because it forces them to create bonds that are not always friendly with each other. And I think that is a big part of the improvisation, because it immediately sets a tone for the relationships in the party. Whereas in D&D, I think you're very much still worried about you as an individual and not your interaction with the party. And how's your game going? Are you still running a game online?
Since we last talked, I haven't run any new games. It's funny, when I'm not running games or getting ready to run a game, I'm usually reading rule books and thinking about games I could be running that I'm not. But the last couple of weeks, I've been... I do have a Fate of Cthulhu game in the running with my wife and daughter. And so for the last week or two, I've been rereading just the Fate rules, and I have a couple of the supplements released for the Fate Core line that can kind of feed into the horror genre. And actually, I have really clicked with the version of Fate that is in the Fate of Cthulhu game.
And how is that different than regular Fate? It's one of those games that I think is right up my alley that I've never played, so I'm super curious about this.
Here's the thing, it's not really different. It's just more streamlined in the way that it's written and communicated. So there's this, just for the listening audience, there's Fate Core, and it's a pretty hefty tome. I want to say it's several hundred pages long, and I'll be totally honest with you. As much as I appreciate Fate Core in the abstract, I've always really bounced off of that rule book for some reason.
Agreed.
And they released a game called Fate of Cthulhu that contains a streamlined version of the Fate rules.
And there's a generic one of that too. There's like Fate. It's Fate Express or Fate Light or something. It's like
they've released
rulebook. I have that too.
Yep, this is in between that Fate Express. I forget the name.
Accelerated.
of it. Fate Accelerated, and what they call it is Fate Condensed, because it's a midway point, and really it's the full Fate rules. They've dropped a couple of, like, I guess what you might call sort of like the edge case types of rules that aren't probably going to come up in most games. Mm-hmm. Mostly, I think it's just a nice feat of game writing They've taken the same rules that they took 300 pages to describe in Fate Core, and they've rewritten it in 50 pages. And I think they've done that by trimming out a lot of the stuff that was mostly in there to anticipate like problems and questions and objections, if that makes sense.
Right, like a 3.5 style rulebook,
yeah,
right? Where you try to cover every scenario.
And the result is they get, 95% of the stuff you're ever really going to need. They deliver that. And if you truly need that extra 5%, there's the Fate Core full rulebook you can go investigate. But really, I don't know that I would really recommend anyone not start with the condensed rules, which are, I think they're free. You can go grab them for free in PDF format at least. But
okay.
Anyway, I don't mean to wax quite so eloquently about this, but I have found myself getting really enchanted by Fate Condensed and by Fate of Cthulhu. And I feel like it's clicked for me in a way that Fate Core has not really clicked to date. So
I should try it out because I look at Fate Core and I say I should love this game, and I think you said it perfectly. I bounce off the rulebook. I pick up this thing and I'm like, I just can't. So
yep.
I'll check it out. That sounds really good.
It did help. I mean, this is some good advice no matter what system you're thinking of getting into. It did also help that about the same time I made a point of going out and finding some actual play podcasts of people running different Fate rules. And I'm not the hugest actual play fan of listening to actual plays, but it did give me a really good, help me understand how a typical game is actually going to play out, which, again, not bagging on the Fate Core rules, but I think it is a special talent to be able to write a role-playing game that really addresses the stuff that you need to know to actually play.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Just two quick things about that. One is, I think looking for actual plays is a great idea. Whenever I run something new, like when I read Kids on Bikes or 10 Candles or Mothership, which are the sort of new games I learned this year, I listened to actual plays of all of those. And it really helped me sort of grasp the rough nature of the game.
It's made me think about how many, when you look at a game like Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or any of these other games that stretch into the hundreds of pages, and I love me a good 500-page rulebook, but there's so much stuff in there that does not come up in play much. There are these rules I read in every single game book I have about drowning and suffocating and how far can you jump and things like that. And I have no doubt that there are games where that comes up and it's useful to have those rules. But I wonder what would happen if, you sat down to play you had a big list of every rule you could put in the book and you just circled the ones that actually came up in a game you played in the last year. I think that you would wind up with like a very trimmed down list from what you get in most rule books these days.
I think that's a great point, and I wonder if Fate Core was the victim of habit, right? People expect to buy a big fat rule book. So if you don't give them one, they don't feel they're getting their money's worth. Even the Dungeon World rule book, which I have next to me, is 300 pages, but the vast majority of this book is monsters, right?
Yeah.
And how to run the campaign. Like only half the book is what you need to play the game. I think that there's an expectation about size, and I think that's starting to change. I like a thinner, tighter rule book. Yeah. It sounds to me like Fate Condensed is 2 more editorial passes of Fate Core.
That's what it feels like.
Different intention. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I definitely want to don't take this as criticism of Fate Core, which I think is a solid system. But I think that Evil Hat really figured it out with Fate Condensed. So if you're listening and you're curious what we're talking about, go check it out. It is time. We've been
talking so long. Why don't I read it again?
Yes. Why don't you revisit the topic that we're supposed to be discussing today?
How much setting creation do you do in advance of playing, and how much do you do during the game itself? Since you rolled, I think it'd be interesting to hear you start with this, Andy, and tell us sort of where you come from on this.
Absolutely. So I have journeyed from one end of this spectrum to the other over the years in which I've been running games. Yes. I started running games with settings that were very much fleshed out and set in stone before the player characters even started their adventuring careers in it. And I'm talking mostly about Middle-earth, but we brought the same sensibility with us when we played Dungeons and Dragons set in the Forgotten Realms or the Spelljammer universe or whatever. When I in the first decade of it's wonderful, isn't it? My first decade of running stuff, I very much started with a setting, a big setting, and usually it was one that was published for me that I would basically study up on the setting before running a game. it was important to me and to my players that the game we were running fit into the contours of whatever that setting was.
Into the universe. So if you're playing in Middle Earth, you have to choose when you're playing because you need to know if the ring has been destroyed yet or not. You need to know all those kind of historical markers that identify that setting and its landmarks as well.
Exactly, and we can't be adventuring in this place because it hasn't been built yet, or it was destroyed 500 years earlier before the PCs came along, that sort of thing.
Right.
So then that's where I started, and that probably is connected to my love of those big fantasy literature epics like Tolkien and his many imitators that also seem to start with a big vision for the world. These days, partly as a practical reality of gaming with busy adults, but also just as a shift in my own interest and temperament, I honestly give very, very little thought to the setting beyond the genre tropes that are found in it, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So I don't have usually a detailed map of the world. I don't know which kingdoms are at war, that sort of thing. I might have a rough sketch of the area, but really, these days I like to zero in on the very specific area that the PCs are likely to play around in and influence in the course of the actual game we're going to play.
Right.
And I don't invest much energy into thinking outside. If it's something the PCs are not likely to really meaningfully interact with, I don't give it any thought. Sorry to ramble there, but that's my big answer to your question. How would you answer the same question?
I have come and gone on this in several different ways, and it sort of depends on what I've encountered last. So I took a break from role-playing and got back into it in the late 90s, and when I started the campaign, the game was the game I had played back in the 80s. It was called Dragon Quest. Actually, I think the very first thing I ran was Rollmaster, and then I decided to switch it to Dragon Quest.
Sir, I salute you. Was Rollmaster just not realistic enough? You had to get more detail.
Yeah. It was kind of fake. No. We decided to switch because I had this love of this game, Dragon Quest, from back in the day, and we played that campaign for a while. It eventually evolved into a 3.5 game that I stopped running. Somebody else was running it, but that first piece, the first thing I did was sort of draw a map of the world, right, and decide what the world was like at a macro level, and then zoomed in. I actually used a D&D adventure. It was one of the last first edition adventures. It was N5 is the number. It was called Under Illifarn, and I used it as setting material because it had a small town in it, and it had an elven glade, and just all the things you need for a basic fantasy world for a bunch of mercenaries to get together. So then what that 3.5 game was based on a setting. I didn't run it, but it was based on the Skarn setting, which was a kind of wild setting. I can't remember who published it from the late 90s.
It sounds really familiar, but I can't think of what that is. But carry on.
The two most recent campaigns I've run have been a mixed bag. There was a Dungeon World actual campaign I ran, which I started using this sort of Mad Lib system, but then just evolved that into a campaign. So as things happened, I added parts to the world, or the players added parts to the world. So I didn't do any prep at all, and we just added parts here and there. And what that led to was a really fun game that everybody had a lot of ownership in, but it was sort of very generic fantasy world, right? There was nothing that I would say was a super inventive thing there, and you know what? That was okay. You don't need to have some crazy derivation from the standard fantasy setting to be successful. But then, my current campaign, I actually just took a setting. It's from Keith Baker's Phoenix Dawn Command. It has a very specific setting that I love. And actually, the mechanics of the game were a non-starter for so many people I tried to introduce the game to. I've actually just basically converted it to Dungeon World. So I'm playing a Dungeon World, but using this setting. But I still let players make up stuff. The setting is rough. In our last session before we went on a little hiatus, they encountered this place. It was called Halfsbridge, and it's like this giant ancient bridge. Nobody knows where it came from, but it extends like a half mile into the air and then just stops. And the nobles live on the top of the bridge, and they were going to go there, and they're like, "Is there like a seedy underbelly town under the bridge?" I'm like, "There is now."
Of course, there is. Yes.
How could there not be? I don't know why I didn't think of it, but yes, there is. And so, I love having that setting because I think the structure of the world in Phoenix Dawn Command is so cool. but I don't fill in all those details. The map is pretty blank, and it lets people come in and insert the things that they think are valuable.
Yeah.
Because what I'm not interested in doing at this point is coming up with, I think like you said, like big countries and their politics and pantheons of gods and all of those kind of things, I think interest me way less than they used to.
Yeah.
And I think setting information for me now is some basic geography and just NPCs and their motivations. I think we think of NPCs as something else, but I think they're actually part of the setting. So NPCs, how they interact and how they're going to interact with the characters are sort of more important for me to come up with these days than where the lake is in this mountain vale. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah.
Have you ever run a game that was in a set-in-stone setting, like, say, Star Wars or something like that, where you did... It was important to navigate within to color inside the lines?
Yes, I have run a Star Wars game, and I've played in a Star Wars game, and I didn't enjoy it as much, because when it's that prescribed, I sometimes feel like there's not a lot of space to play in. It sort of depends. Star Wars is a big universe, so I think people play that game and they come up with a lot of fun things to do that aren't in any of the movies.
Yep.
But that setting, I didn't enjoy playing in that setting as much as a sort of more made-up setting. I think, like, if you were to compare it to, say, Robin Law's Ashen Stars, like, I'd rather play in that. Because though it's a prescribed setting, it at least is fresh, which I think is part of the appeal for me. Because the other way, I think we talked about this in a previous episode, but the other way that works is discovering. So there's a joy in discovering the Tower of Amansul in your Middle-earth game, right? And that's kind of fun. But there's also kind of like, well, then that sets specific rules about what that encounter is like that are very limiting. So, I think I've gone from one side of that to the other over time.
This is a big topic, so I beg your pardon if I sort of drift around within it a bit.
No, that's good.
Here's something I see in a lot of role-playing games that have established settings where the expectation is that you're playing within the setting. So your Star Wars is basically.
Right.
I always see lots of kind of canonical stuff statted up and detailed.
Yes.
I mean, you would not stat that stuff up if the intent were not for the players to engage with it. So using Star Wars as our example, you open a Star Wars role-playing book, you have stats for Luke Skywalker in there and Darth Vader and that sort of thing. But in my personal games and in my experience of interacting with other gamers, I don't know anyone who doesn't usually run with those settings off in their own direction. I don't know anyone who has met Luke Skywalker or battled Darth Vader in Star Wars games. So I feel often, even with these very defined settings, I think just an awful lot of gamers just have this instinctive need to carve out their own space within it.
Yeah, this is always a struggle. And, I was thinking of an example. I ran a game of Stormbringer, which is the Elric role-playing game. It's been called Stormbringer and Elric and different things a long time ago. So maybe my memory is poor. But the big thing for me with that was, they stat up Elric, like you say. But I think if you run into Elric, it overshadows your characters. I remember in the James Bond role-playing game, which stats up James Bond and Miss Moneypenny and Holly Goodnight and Teehee and all the James Bond, Jaws, all the James Bond villains and characters. And, to run into James Bond villains is weird. But additionally, the book says, look, if your characters get in over their heads, just have Bond come in and save them, right? No. Which just sounds like the least fun play experience I can think of, right? Because you're these characters who are trying to make their way in MI6, and here comes James Bond stealing all your thunder. So I actually think you're right. I think people avoid, the really strong things, but they really want to play in those worlds at the same time. So it's a balance. Yeah. There was a game, the Indiana Jones role-playing game. Do you remember this one?
I've never played it, but I am familiar with it, yeah.
Well, the rule of it is you don't make your own character. You just pick one. So somebody's Indy, and everybody else is short round, right? So, I mean, how much fun is that, right? So I don't know. Having too strong a setting is something I guess I've avoided. Though, in my latest campaign, I have a really specific setting. I think the difference with that is it's not canonical. It's still new to the players. Yeah. Even if I've read the setting a couple of times. And I think that is a big difference between that and playing in, say, Faerun or Star Wars or The Forgotten Realms.
What are some just basic traits of a setting that gets your interest?
the reason I find the setting that I've chosen interesting is because it has a plot built in. It's not just an almanac of the world. It says, have adventures here. It says, here's an almanac of the world, and boy is this world in trouble because all this stuff is going on, and you've been recruited to help fight this thing. The world really needs your help. So the setting is, the characters are immediately drawn into the setting because of things in a desperate situation, right? So I don't like settings like the Forgotten Realms, for example, when you used to look at that setting, or Greyhawk. It was cool. I enjoyed reading them, but it was just an almanac. And where do you start? And then that's what the modules were for, right? If you play in the Forgotten Realms and then you'd start it under Ilan and that would be your entry. So that was good. But just that sort of almanac style doesn't really interest me. And I think the other big thing is it has some sort of unique trait to it. It doesn't have to be completely different, though. Again, I'd say Phoenix Dawn Command is pretty unique because it eschews sort of the standard fantasy races and that kind of stuff. It has to have something slightly different. Like I ran a Dragon Age RPG. I enjoyed that game, and I just remember thinking, oh, these are a lot of things I expect, except the elves are different, right? The elves are sort of grungy, and the city elves kind of are beggars, and that having that difference between the standard fantasy tropes creates a lot of interest for me. Yeah. If it's just straight up elves, dwarves, and orcs, I may be less interested than something that mixes it up a little bit.
I have over the years read a large number of what you might call those almanac-style setting guides, right, to various things.
I still love to read them, don't get me wrong.
Oh, they're wonderful to read. But what I found myself maybe 10 or 15 years ago is when I started to articulate this reaction I was having to these settings. Is I would read a great setting like the setting of Eclipse Phase is a specific example. Before that, Transhuman Space, I had all these books for that line. And the settings are amazing. It was interesting to read the books, but the settings were so complete and so well fleshed out that I didn't know what you would do in the setting. I mean, when you often see this sort of this pitch from role-playing games that you can be anything you want. You can do anything. Anything you can imagine you can do in this setting. That used to sound very exciting to me. But nowadays when I hear that, a little yellow flag goes off. Because these days, I want to know, what's the story we're going to tell? What are we going to do? And then I would rather start with that. What's the experience I want us to have? And then build a setting that kind of supports that. Rather than start with a wonderfully defined setting and then look around in it for a space that fits the story, try to carve out a space in it that fits the experience I want to have. Does that make sense?
That makes complete sense. And when you say that, what my mind immediately went to, I think that's great. And what my mind immediately went to was the Gumshoe games from Pelgrane Press. Because what they do is they do offer fairly complete settings, like, say, Night's Black Agents, for example, right? Here's a setting. The world is a scary place. It's full of vampires. But here's the game. At the beginning of the game, you guys find out, you're spies, you find out that there are vampires, and the vampires are part of the espionage community, and you immediately get burned and you're on the run. Go. Right? Like, so is that the experience you want to have? Or Ashen Stars is, you're investigators. Space has been closed off for a long time. Now it's opened up. You're investigators with this particular unit. You need these kind of people in your unit. Go. So I think we're agreeing here in that I like a setting that gives the characters something specific to do. Because I think, especially in modern role-playing, I think saying you can do anything you want is kind of a little bit of a cheat. That's, I think, one of the reasons I like these Powered by the Apocalypse games, because the roles are very specific. And the design of the game is in Monster of the Week, you are monster hunters. You're not going in there to be the monsters. You're not going in there to be news reporters. You are the people hunting the monsters. And the setting is whatever kind of monsters you want to hunt. So I'm agreeing with you 100%, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Powered by the Apocalypse games, because I honestly avoided games of that ilk for longer than I should have, because I saw that the story was pretty well defined, and I'm used to, like, give me the almanac and I'll come up with my own story to fit within it. And so when I would see, Apocalypse World, some of the more recent variants, I would think, well, what if I don't want to play that specific scenario? What if I don't want to play in that particular story? But having read, like, Blades in the Dark and Band of Blades and Tachyon Squadron for the Fate system, these games that they're probably better described as just, like, campaigns.
Yeah.
Not settings. And I guess the downside is, yes, when you pick up Band of Blades, you're going to have a lot of work to do if you don't want to run with the campaign that it clearly is assuming that you're going to do. There was a time in my life where that downside would have been too much. But these days, I see that less as a downside and more as a time and energy saving.
Yeah, and resource. I think it goes back to, I was just thinking of another Powered by the Apocalypse game, because there's Dungeon World, which is sort of close to D&D in the sense that you still have to make your own adventures, though it gives you a method for doing so, which takes the pressure off. But another game I picked up and I haven't had a chance to play, it's called The Sword, the Crown, and the Unspeakable Power. It's a Powered by the Apocalypse game. It has playbooks, it has moves, but it's very specifically designed to be like Game of Thrones, right? There's a sword, there's a goal, the crown, and then there's some unspeakable power. So the unspeakable power in Game of Thrones is the dragons, right? So who controls that power? So that kind of idea where you can jump into a genre simply by the rule set that you pick, right? Because it'll be familiar to you if you play Dungeon World, but it's not the same, and the devil's in the details. So, like you're saying, it's a campaign and a style of game you're buying into when you pick it up. I have another one called Ruma, which is about adventuring as Roman legionnaires in a world that is fantastic. It's grounded in the Roman world, but it's fantastic as well. So I love that the game's a game that now has those kind of intentions behind it.
So you just mentioned a Roman-inspired setting. Have you run many games that are set in a fairly realistic historical setting?
No, I tend to... What I enjoy about fantasy literature and science fiction are the more fantastic, unexplainable aspects about it. So I like when they're grounded in reality, but have a fantastic twist to them. So I don't run deeply historical games. That's not super entertaining for me.
Yeah. I think the most historical game I've run is Call of Cthulhu, set in the 1920s.
Yes.
There are some campaigns I would like to run one day, or that I sort of daydream about running, that are set in specific time periods in history.
Right.
I would love to run, a game set in ancient Rome or the late Roman Empire, and some other specific time periods. But talk about settings that are very fleshed out and very defined. That's one where the pressure I would feel to do my homework in advance is off-putting to me. That sounds like a lot of work. So,
yes, it does. And I think the other thing I would want to say about that is, I think I like a game now. I have noticed, and people may disagree with me, but I think the point of a lot of these games where the setting isn't fully fleshed out now is that people are more invested in a game where they are developing part of it. Right, so if the whole thing's spelled out, what you're really hoping is that everybody's as excited about the setting as you are. And that can happen, right? Star Wars is the best example. Star Wars is fun. I want to play a character like Han Solo. I want to play a young Jedi who's just learning how to do it. I want to do all these different things. Well, that is people being excited about the setting. But for example, this Phoenix Dawn Command game, I'm excited about the setting. But nobody else has read this setting. So rather than try to get them to be excited about the things I'm excited about, I think it's important to let them introduce parts of the setting so that they have buy-in to the game, which makes for more engaged players and a more fun game. So I think that's a huge part of saving part. One of the rules in Dungeon World is draw maps but leave blanks, right? And I think that's super critical because you need to fill in things after the fact to get good player engagement.
Yeah, and it sounds intimidating, because you are leaving your setting wide open to go in directions you weren't expecting or anticipating, or maybe in directions you aren't initially super thrilled about, right? But the flip side of it is that situation you just described. I've certainly been in the situation where I'm the GM. I've read the 400-page almanac of the ancient kingdoms of whatever. Nobody else at the table has. Nobody else at the table will. So I've got to communicate to them, not only feed them enough info that they can act believably within this setting, and I've also got to convey my enthusiasm for the setting.
Right.
And that's a big ask. I mean, think about it. It's when you have your players, enthusiastically coming alongside you in building out the setting. It's just so much less work.
It is, and I think there's a laziness to it that is part of it for me, right? Like as you were saying, with an adult life, I don't have time to read the whole almanac, and I don't have time to pick out the parts that are going to be in there. Like I was reading I think we've talked about it before, one of my favorite games from AD&D was The Sinister Secret of Saltmarsh. I love that adventure. So when Ghosts of Saltmarsh came out, I picked it up because that's one of my favorites. And it's not bad, right? It's a good adventure, but I just started reading about the politics. They've added a layer of complexity to the interactions of the NPCs and the politics of the town and the different factions of the region. And I just want to go to sleep. That's not the part of the game that I'm super interested in. So, yeah, I think you can give too much.
Why do you think that, as we talk about this, whether we're talking about a Middle-earth level detailed setting or something you're throwing together on the fly with Dungeon World, why do you think we start with maps?
That is a great question. I think because of the origins of the hobby, right? I'm thinking that maybe maps aren't the most important thing, but what if the people around you are the most important thing? This is a role-playing game, and one of the keys to the game is interacting with people, whether they be NPCs or other players. So what if the first thing you did, because you're right, I start with maps, it doesn't matter the game, but what if you played a game, there is a game like this, it's called Fiasco, it has no maps, and what you do is you define your character and then you define the relationships in a prescribed manner with the people around you, and that is the setting for the game. You're given a time, a sort of genre, and then you're given your relationships, and then you role play for 3 hours without one map. So I think that's really interesting. What you said is that why do we start with maps? Is it because we already have? I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know. It's hard I suspect that it is, as you say, rooted in just how the hobby began and the things that were most inspirational to the people that gave birth to this hobby. So they were coming out of Lord of the Rings, they were coming out of Moorcock, they were coming out of these places, and those are, I guess Moorcock not so much, but Lord of the Rings is like the king of the map-driven
maps.
Fantasy realms, right? And then every lesser fantasy writer who followed Tolkien modeled that. They all these books always first
today. Brandon Sanderson has maps in his books.
You flip open, and before you even get to the text of your book, you're seeing a map. I do sometimes wonder if our hobby had. I know Gygax was influenced by a lot of non-Tolkien writers, but I think Tolkien's influence is pretty darn strong in D&D, and I do wonder if the influence of Conan and Moorcock and maybe Narnia, some of those other places that are a little fuzzier when it comes to the definition of the setting. I wonder if the hobby would look very different, if D&D would look very different, if it wasn't a map that was, the starting point.
Interesting.
I think there's a map of, for instance, Conan's setting, but when you read the stories, it feels very hazy.
It's very hand-wavy. Yeah, it's like he's in this rough... It's basically like he's in what feels like the Old West, or he's in what feels like Lawrence of Arabia, or he's in what feels like, the deep jungle.
Exactly.
But it's not beyond that, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and those are, when you think about, for instance, those Conan stories, those don't feel like the author saying, what would happen if Conan traveled to this country and this city on the map? Instead, they feel like, what would it be like if Conan were suddenly a king for some reason? Or what if he were
in a city pirate that's known... Yeah, or that they're known for thieves. It's the city of thieves.
Yeah.
How can you have a whole city of thieves? Who knows? Who cares? But what a cool idea. Let's put Conan there, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there a fantasy setting? Please write in and tell me that does not have some sort of a thieves city.
Yeah.
There
is, like Thieves World, for example, has a pretty strong thief element to it.
there you go.
Yeah.
So here's a question. I have sort of a closing question for you. So with your Dungeon World, you obviously do a lot of whipping up settings on the fly. To what extent do you stick to the setting that you create, I guess? So is the stuff that your characters came up with in your last Dungeon World setting, is that permanent? Are you going to go on and build on that for your next game?
Yeah, because I think you need to. I think you need some place to start. So, this was just a one-shot, but this floating castle exists. They actually crashed it.
Of course they did.
Of course they did. I think you need that to start. Now, permanent is maybe not the right word. It's the solid ground. But if somebody said to me, I said I wanted to be from this town that was like this, and I think I've changed my mind, I would be totally open to that. So I think that I do not like to carve it in stone once it's said. I like to use it as inspiration to come up with new stuff to push the game forward. But I don't, in fact, I'm horrible at taking notes. I always have to say, remember that guy? Who's that guy? You know, I'm always asking my players, like, back when you were in that one city. It's a little embarrassing. But yeah, I'm not super dedicated to defining it without flexibility.
Have you, I said that was the last question, but I was lying. Are there any specific settings that you want to explore specifically through the medium of a role-playing game?
There's two games that I've really wanted to try and I've never played in two of my favorite worlds. One is Star Trek, either the original or the Next Generation sort of Deep Space Nine time frame.
Yep.
I enjoy both of those very much, and I've never played in a game in them, and I think it's because I'm too worried about the amount of pre-existing history there. Though the good news is, especially with Star Trek, like literally there's always something new to explore.
Yes.
So, and the other one is Conan, because I don't know that it's the setting so much as the feel.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've encountered a game as much as I've tried that quite gets it right. I mean, Conan is problematic in a number of ways, but there is this visceral sword and sorcery feel to it that is unique. Like,
yes,
I think there was a quote, I think it was actually from Stephen King, who said, Conan's stories looks like Howard is just fumbling over himself to get these stories out, right? Like they are so propulsive and so just intense. I mean, there are other stories that are intense, and I've seen them, but that was my sort of first encounter with those kind of stories. So I would love to play in that sort of sword and sorcery world that is, just all pulse pounding action all the time.
Yeah, it's telling that there are so many games that aim for that, but I'd be hard pressed to say I personally have seen a game that quite nails it. Now, I have to say, it is funny. I think that there's an official Star Trek role-playing game, which I've played, and it's very good, by the way.
Okay, I have it. Somebody sent it to me. Somebody's like, I have a copy. Anybody want it? I'm like, I'll take it, but I haven't had a chance to play it.
It's very good if your idea of Star Trek...
isn't it?
Yes, it is. If what you want out of Star Trek is to kind of mirror the pacing of an episode of the TV show, I think it would be a great game to run it.
Talking.
If I were to run it, I would lay it out as a season of the show, and with discrete episodes. But funnily, amusingly, I think they also publish Conan. So I think you need to check them out.
Check out Modiphius. There's one game I want to mention. Actually, I want to ask you the same question you asked me, but there's one other game. In the Discord, somebody was talking about this. It's called Swords Without Master, and it's supposed to emulate Conan. I have not played it. I've read through the rules. I want to try it. Kyle Latino, I think, had tried it in an online game and said, it's okay, but I really want to try it face-to-face with other people interested in a sword and sorcery game to see what that's like. So what about you? What's a setting that you haven't played that you really want to?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that for me, it's the couple of historical settings. Here's a mixed historical and fantastic setting. So I studied it in school, so I've got this built-in bias. I really love the Byzantine Empire, and I love the city of Constantinople. And I've never run a game set there. But I would love to run a game set in either Rome, towards the end of the Roman period, or in Byzantium, because those settings evoke in me that just feeling of the twilight of an empire. Right. With both of those, there's that wonderful pathos of the end is coming, but it's glorious and decadent right now. I would love to explore, especially the city of Constantinople, either on the brink of one of the crusade, like the Fourth Crusade, or maybe much further down in its history when the writing was on the wall for it. I would love to explore that setting. And that's a situation where I probably do have enough historical background with it that I could run it confidently. But I don't know how interested I guess I've never really pitched this to any groups. I don't know how interesting the city of Constantinople is.
I think it would be fascinating, because I think if you can pull the fascinating sort of magical parts out, those could make an impression on somebody else. Yeah. And what it would have the impact of making you jazzed about running it, and the players would sense your enthusiasm.
It's for what it's worth, it's the whole like Byzantine Empire is like an underserved setting.
It feels like
games.
that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like even Mike Duncan did a 250 episode podcast on the history of Rome, which ends with, and then the Western Empire ended, and the Byzantine Empire continued for a few hundred more years. The end, right?
Oh man, yeah, that's like my pet peeve right there. Yeah, they've. I think I own most of the role playing books set in Constantinople, and
Nice.
they are a scattered and eclectic bunch. There's like a source book for Vampire: The Dark Ages set in Constantinople. Nice. There's an Ars Magica book set in the Byzantine Empire. There's like a random Unknown Armies scenario set in Constantinople. It's this weird scattering of books, but maybe it's my job to write this as an adventure setting.
Well, just to bring it all together, Michael Moorcock's sort of latest novels are a 4-novel series about Byzantium and the Byzantine Empire. So,
are you serious?
Yes, I am. I don't know if you can even find them.
What are they? What are the names?
I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay.
But yeah, look them up. Look up Michael Moorcock, Byzantium, and maybe it's something different. This is just my recollection. I have not read them, but it seems like something you should check out based on all of our previous conversations.
Oh my goodness, I will. I have to say, I talk up Moorcock an awful lot on the show, and I love Elric dearly, but my last couple of Moorcock novels I've read, some of his more recent stuff, have left me a little flat.
Yeah.
And I recently read one, I think it was called The Dream Thief's Daughter. And
yes.
It was following one of Elric's incarnations set.
Uh-huh.
And I knew that the end was coming for me and my relationship with Moorcock's work when he stuck Elric and Hitler in the same room, and Elric didn't kill Hitler. Like some contrivance happened, and I was all I ever wanted from Elric was for him to wade into Hitler's council room and pull out that sword of his. And yeah,
that sounds really good. Yeah, and the older novels are a bit of a struggle too. They're a bit damsel in distressy, and like a lot of old fantasy, they have a lot of those same problems. But
for sure,
I'm curious to see what his Byzantium books are like. So
yes, well, yeah. I mean, having just sneered at Mr. Moorcock's recent work, I am also going, as soon as we're done podcasting here, I'm going to rush and Google and see if I can get those at the local library. So
there you go.
All right.
All right.
We've been
Awesome.
going on. We're coming up on an hour. And
all right.
I've certainly enjoyed this conversation, John, but we should bring it to a close. Do you have any parting shots for GMs that are getting ready to set up a game and thinking these big questions about what's the setting going to be?
I think you said it earlier, and I'll just repeat your wisdom, which was build enough of the setting to get started, and that is what will help you the most. And build a setting that you yourself are interested in, because your enthusiasm for the setting has to come through. If you're running a setting, if you don't like vampires and your friends talk you into running the Curse of Strahd, right? Nobody's going to have any fun. So pick a setting that engages you, that gives you, and start with just the amount you need to get the game going.
That is fantastic advice, yeah. And saves your... Not only will it ensure a more fun game, but it'll just do the work you need to do to have the experience you want, and don't do extra unless you genuinely derive joy from doing that. So
Exactly.
All right, well, we're going to wrap it up here. This has been Roll for Topic. I have been Andy Rao.
And I've been John Corey.
And soon Chris will be rejoining us, but not quite yet, so we'll leave you in suspense. And in the meantime, happy gaming, everybody. And remember, as Chris would undoubtedly say, if your players are having fun, you are a great GM.
Awesome. Still miss you, Chris.
Come back soon.